Subsistence farming is the #1 livelihood of the rural poor. As we were driving in northern Ghana, I saw this scene on one of the dirt roads that appeared with all these women walking, carrying cassava on their heads, this rooted vegetable. The men were following along, holding some machete-type instruments that they used to help cut the brush. But you never saw them ever carrying these heavy loads on their heads. It was mostly the women who are the workforce. Driving down that same dirt road, I saw these 2 tiny boys holding these hoes over their shoulders. And my first thought was, well, where are these tiny little boys going? Why aren't they going to school? And stopped the crew so that we could follow them, and as a result wound up spending half a day with them and their family, and they were harvesting yams. This family was pretty desperate, and all of the children were working very hard with no protection whatsoever, barefooted with their hoes that were very sharp. The whole entire family, 7 children, were all working under the guidance of their father out in this field, trying to harvest and work with this vegetable. They were having a very bad year. They were actually eating and living off of last year's harvest.
We are very, very poor. We are very, very poor. We are suffering for food.
Many of the world's subsistence farmers, because of changes that can happen very, very quickly, are in fact not only impoverished, but malnourished. They have bloated bellies. They don't eat properly at all. They don't eat regularly. They may eat food that they grew last year rather than this year.
Normally, they have a harvest that they can eat and then they can sell half of it. But in this situation, due to climate change and lack of rain, their harvest was very poor.
It was going to make 2, but this one is small, so I want to use this one as seedlings. We depend on rain, so in some years the crops will dry. Then it will be a problem for us. Even what to eat is a problem. It's very, very difficult.
All of the children were suffering from malaria, and they couldn't afford to get them any medicine because they weren't able to sell the half that they normally sell, and the one half they were just hoping to use to eat for the next year. I photographed Jacaba, an 80-year-old woman who was hunched over working in her fields. She was widowed and living by herself. And she was not exactly happy that I was there and wanted to photograph her, because she was blaming the Western world for her crops were not good. As a result of little rain and an early frost, she was not able to feed her animals anymore and had to sell them, and was struggling to have food to eat. When I saw this woman working so hard, hunched over, her hands just battered, it came to my mind that nowhere did I find women that weren't working extremely hard. Closely associated with families that live on the land are also children and families who herd. In Nkwanta, which is northern Volta region of Ghana, I found these 4 little children ranging from age 5 to 7. They were nicknamed Little Cowboys. They would go out from sunrise to sunset herding these cows that were probably, I'd say, about 4 times their size.
Sometimes these animals belong to them, but often they do not. Sometimes these animals are being cared for by children, usually for a neighbor, someone who has far more in the way of assets. And the family of the children gets some sort of cut for the services they're providing in the taking care of these animals.
They all said to me that they were all in the fear of being snake bitten because their father had been blinded by a snake bite and one of their brothers had been killed by a snake. They were running through this bush with no protection whatsoever, no shoes, and were not allowed to come home early because they would be beaten by their father. None of them could go to school, and all of them wished that they could aspire to be something else, a teacher, a doctor, a soccer player, even Nelson Mandela. In the mountains of Bolivia, 13,000 feet above sea level, I found a similar child who was herding alpaca. His father had died, and he was the main breadwinner for the family that were subsisting on the fur of the alpaca.
These nomads are these people who live on property, usually again of someone else, and take care of these animals, do so for almost no money. It's very common to find one of these families living on less than $200 a year. Sometimes they live in very, very remote areas, and if a family member gets sick, they simply die because they have little or no access to decent medical care.
They had very little. They were living in a house where they had no beds. They were sleeping on the floor. They had no electricity. They had no running water except for what was coming down from the mountains. He was able to attend school. He would get up very early in the morning, and he would herd them out to pasture. He would go to school, and then he would come back and herd them back. And he basically said, I'm herding, I'm going to school, I'm the head of the family, and life is very hard. Another story that we found in the hillside of Peru was Aldair, a 13-year-old boy who was taken in with his mother. They had been sleeping on the streets, and he was given a job as a pig farmer. And he was living with an older man who was a farmer himself who needed help. As a result, he wasn't able to finish going to school, although he was 14, elevated to the 2nd grade. But he was really proud that he had gotten that far. And you could see, even in this little makeshift wooden structure that he was living in, there were these pictures of him when he had graduated from school. All he really wished that he could do is return to school, but was not able.
Not only do they not go to school, or go to school late, or go to school erratically, the land itself poses a lot of dangers for little children. So these are not safe occupations. There seems to be very, very little regulation to keep them in school.
You can see in one scene he is riding on a motorcycle and all these dogs are barking and chasing him as he goes down into the village to try to find scraps and things to feed the pigs. And in another scene, you'll see that these big batches of the food and garbage that he had found were being boiled to burn off the bacteria so that they could feed these pigs. A lot of families in extreme poverty rely on pigs and pig farming for their livelihood. Throughout our travels, we didn't just focus on people who live off the land, but also the waterways throughout the world. In one scene, we see fishermen living off of the Mekong River in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. And I came across this little girl, and she was 4 years old, and she was pouring water over her head, washing herself in this polluted waterway. And she had been out on the boats all day with her parents trying to catch some fish, because this is how they support their lives.
They may fish rivers, they may fish the sea. It's their only access to free food. Of the world's poor, 40 million around the world spend their entire lives simply fishing, usually with their families, usually on small boats, selling what extra fish they've been able to acquire at markets throughout the world. And in fact, the fishing they do provides enough food for 200 million people on this planet. So not only does this keep them alive, but it helps keep many, many other people alive around the world.
The boats were these tiny wooden boats. They used these big oars to navigate. There's one little girl in one of the pictures, and she's working at the bow of the boat, trying to help steer it. And none of the children are going to school. This whole generation of families since the Khmer Rouge have lived on this river. There's one scene where you see all the boats are docked, and across you see the whole city of Phnom Penh at night. And there is this little boy in the foreground and there's parents in the background, and they're mending the net, which is their biggest commodity, because without having that net, they have no livelihood. There's one scene on the boat where you can see that they don't have very much. All of their belongings, they've got their clothing spread out, they had washed in the river that's drying, and a little girl is holding a pet chicken on the boat. These families subsist by eating their catch and also selling them at market. I followed or chronicled a family, a mom who was 36 years old and had suffered multi-generational abuse along with her daughter, who was 16. Both of them had tiny children that they were trying to support, and the mother had 6 children of her own, 2 of which were still with one of the husbands working in the agricultural fields. She was living in a one room with no electricity, no running water. The whole family was living in there, her daughter, herself, and the 4 other children.
The truth of the matter is that domestic violence is one of the biggest drivers of poverty all over the world. It affects, of course, women and children the most, and it's responsible for making women and children one of the largest segments of the world's poor.
Every time there's an incident of domestic violence, it's the woman and the children who have to move. They leave everything behind.
She had this whole route that she had where she would go to try to find things to recycle. And the children who could not attend school because she really needed them to help find recyclables.
She has absolutely no access to medical care. She has and owns no real property. She has very limited personal property, and she has children to feed. So she turns to the streets and gathers up recyclables in any way she can.
They do the jobs that nobody else in the whole wide world wants to do. They do them under the most adverse of circumstances. Their health is at risk. Their children's health is at risk.
Life is just all on her shoulders. Like everything is dependent on them finding these recyclables so that they can eat for the day. They had really very little to eat. I think they had had one little thing of yogurt in the morning to eat. The older daughter, who was 16, who had been abused also by the same husband that had abused the mother, had been kicked out at the age of 14 and also had a little baby. There's the scene in the room and the mother is breastfeeding her baby, her daughter is breastfeeding her baby. The daughter had just lost her job that day, and they were really on the brink of not figuring out how they were really going to exist. I also did another story focusing on domestic violence with Maria, who had real physical scars on her face, on her arms, from being abused by several husbands. She had 3 sons, and she was living on a hillside in like a tiny 10-by-10 shack.
Ay, Dios mío, dime dónde está mi madre, que la busco y no puedo encontrarla.
With very little options in life, she thought up this idea to sing to try to make money.
En el día a día de la madre, ese día lloran ya mis ojos, encontrar así como no, igual cariño, ya no, ya no.
On buses, she had an audience that actually couldn't be helped, had to watch her and had to listen to her. Many times working late into the night. At one point I photographed 3 of her sons in the evening with the full moon as they waited for their mom to come home so that they could eat some dinner. But she is able to at least send them to school, and she's hopeful that she's going to be able to raise 3 boys into men that won't be abusers.
In traveling the world and trying to capture the lives of individuals who live in desperate poverty, we discovered one thing, that it was very, very hard, if not impossible, to spend time with individuals, with their children, at their homes, without trying to do something to improve their lot, certainly before we left them. Often it was just a small gift, but nevertheless it meant a lot to them, and often, too, members of our crew were motivated to do more.
I was the videographer that worked on the Living on $1 a Day project with Renee Byer. It was amazing traveling all around the world and spending a day or 2 each with families that live in such an entirely different situation than we know. On one of the shoots, I had an experience that really touched my heart. It was a family we met that was living on the streets in India. We were shooting in Old Delhi, an area of India's capital city that looks like it hasn't changed much in 1,000 years. We met a 14-year-old blind girl named Hunupa, who was supporting her mother and little brother by begging 10 hours a day. They had been stranded in Delhi after traveling from their small village in northeast India in search of medical help, both for Hunupa and her younger brother. They found themselves living on the sidewalk, unable to leave Delhi, and the mother, due to her own medical issues, unable to do the kind of physical work that was the only way she knew how to earn money. The children couldn't go to school because they didn't have IDs, as the village they came from didn't issue birth certificates. Besides, their only source of income was to have Hunupa sit in a wheelchair and beg all day so that they might earn about $1 and survive one more day. With the children not going to school, they would be caught in a cycle of poverty that never ends. Each night, they spread out a tarpon blanket and tried to sleep on the hard concrete in the heat. They had no hope of improving their situation. There's no such thing as a safety net for the poor in a place like India. I was touched by this innocent family, who, through no fault of their own, had no chance of making their lives better. I had trouble sleeping in my comfortable hotel bed that night. And the next day I went out and purchased some folding cots, so the family might at least sleep off the hard sidewalk. That cost me $25. I didn't have much money, but I told that family that I would try to help them further if I possibly could.
One of the more compelling stories that we highlighted in the book was a story about some children who live on an e-waste dump site in the capital of Ghana, Accra, and their lives there. Just so we all understand what e-waste is, it's short for electronic waste. And it really is made up of all of the electronic devices that the developed world produces each year. These children are often forgotten, they're abandoned, they're throwaway kids that in some cases parents couldn't afford to raise them. Many of them are below the age of 10, many are girls, many are simply not safe, and of course all of them live in a toxic environment that over the course of some time will kill them.
As part of this project, I traveled to Ghana to report on e-waste. It was this huge, miles of just trashed computers and all kinds of electric supplies from the Western world. But what was the most harrowing were these little children that were sifting through this with their hands all blackened, their faces were full of soot, they were wearing flip-flops, they had no protective gear, and they were working to try to find little tiny metals so that they could make enough money to survive to the next day.
This used to be the lagoon. This is now a tidal creek that is a dump site between the shanties where these orphans are living, sleeping on the floor, breathing in the smoke every day from the fires of the burning of the electronics. Contrary to what a lot of people believe, most of the electronic waste is not inherently valuable. It actually is a service that is needed to be done to take care of the toxic materials in it. Some things, of course, are valuable. There's some gold, there's some copper in circuit boards, but most of the material is problematic and is actually can be quite toxic.
Fatty, she was 8 years old. She had her tears streaming down her face from the effects of malaria. And I was stuck sort of in my tracks. I was afraid to raise my camera because I was afraid if I raised my camera that she would turn away and I wouldn't be able to capture this emotional, gripping image. So very slowly I raised my camera to photograph her, you know, amongst this scene and tried to frame this picture where her face had all these tears streaming down. And I never got her face out of my mind. I'd seen a lot of pictures of e-waste, but I'd never seen any of children and the actual effects that it was on these children. Many of them live in tiny little structured wooden buildings banded together with other children, or else they're basically just sleeping on the streets. It's just almost unimaginable that we have children that are working to survive like this. My fear is that you look at the photograph, but it's so alien and so foreign that you look away. There was another little boy, his name was Philemon, and I think he was about 14, and he had escaped an abusive life and was an orphan. And he was also living and sleeping on the ground in the same site, and he was completely blackened. When you look at this photograph, his hands, his face, I don't think anyone can imagine their child looking like this. When I went home that evening and had taken off my shoes and taken off my socks, my feet were just as black as what he was. And that just shows you how toxic and how awful this carbon and this hazardous waste is for these children. So you can imagine these children and the impact on them. No one can really prepare you for a scene like this. It's almost like a scene out of a movie. It's not even real. When we approached it, it looked like Armageddon. It was just this really vast wasteland that I've never seen before. And so it's really hard to take that and translate that into a photograph so that everyone can understand how huge this problem is. These children have absolutely no idea the hazardous conditions that they're living in. And it's really impossible to break them out of this cycle without help from the Western world, who's actually contributing to this mess.
More and more of this material is being created every day. We're actually creating what I refer to as mountains of e-waste. 50 million metric tons per year is estimated to be generated globally. The most devastating thing that happens is that they burn the material. So when you burn this material, the metals, the organics, the brominated flame retardants, you create some of the most toxic fumes known. And these kids are breathing it day in and day out.
Aisha, she's a 10-year-old little girl who is sort of sitting there. She's got her little flip-flops on and she's just lost. My heart goes out to these children and what could possibly be the long-term effects that have gone into their little bodies, basically, and submerged into their lungs.
And here's the gold mine, supposedly. They found some copper cable, and they'll be able to get a few pennies for that. We have this idea that we throw things away. This place called Away is this magical place that really doesn't exist. Away is a real place, and people live there. And people are suffering there from our toys, our tools.
At one point when I was photographing Fatty, she looked really down, so I asked the interpreter, what's the matter? Why is she so upset? And she said, well, that's because she really wants to go home with you.
Part of the reason we put together this book was to highlight some of the work of these people around the world who simply care enough to take time out from their own lives to make the lives of others better. They are really the world's true heroes. They're there on the front lines every day, caring for people that almost no one else cares for.
As I approach the slum settlement, which is in northern India in the foothills of the Himalayas, I'm looking over all of these tent-like structures. There's over 600 people that are living with basically very little.
Throughout the world, particularly in the developing world, what we find, and what you may have seen in your own travels, it's what's been called pocket slums. They're not the huge slums you might find in a movie like Slumdog Millionaire. However, in any large city, you will find thousands of them.
Well, I guess we should go down and try to find a family. Hello? 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 The Tan Len Charitable Trust has stepped in to help aid, and they're starting in this grassroots way to break this cycle of poverty.
The biggest problem is in the home, the family doesn't care anything and doesn't have any kind of like responsibility for the kids.
There's two pictures here. One is a mother, and she's holding her daughter, Sangrita. The daughter only weighs 9 pounds, and she's 2 years old. and she's being starved on purpose so that her mother can beg with her on the streets so that she can earn money to help feed her other children. The picture is so harrowing that I worry that people will just flip the page instead of looking into the eyes of this child and trying to imagine their child in this child.
Most of these family and most of these ladies are begging in the street. The mother used the baby to get the more money. In the slum community, 98% of the children are malnutrition and anemic or underweighted.
Could you even fathom a baby being starved on purpose just so that the mother could feed her other children? Later, that child actually was saved by the mobile medical clinic that came through that slum settlement. There's hope for this little girl. But there are 18,000 children under the age of 5 that die every day from preventable causes. It's actually nice to have cool weather for once. We've been in 115 degrees. I could see people underneath these sort of tarp-like structures, and this was all they had. This was their home. Good portrait. Just a portrait, just a posed picture. But 15-year-old with a little baby. Coming from work?
Yeah, together.
Uh-huh. Hello? Hello?
My name is Pinky.
Your name is, you can say your name, very good English. My name's Renee. They've even gone and built a shower, solar powered, so that these children are now getting a shower every day. This is the biggest joy for them. It's so swelteringly hot there.
We have 3 ladies working with us from the communities. One lady called Rita. She used to beg in the McLaughlins. We offered the job down there, washing the children, and she's working so good, and she washes every day 70 or 60 children in the morning.
Just building these tents and having these slight little bit of education and food for them and showers for them, it's really giving them hope.
In traveling to Peru, in fact, Lima, Peru, we came across a gentleman named Miguel Rodriguez, who was again one of the heroes of the world.
People ask me all the time, what can I do? How can I help? How can one person do anything? Miguel Rodriguez exemplifies the extraordinary good that one person can do. After suffering a loss of his own, His child at 6 months old had died of some illness of the heart, was leaving the hospital and saw 2 street children and looked over at them and thought, why couldn't you have taken them? Why did you take my little boy? And then he felt terrible.
Ese momento es el que cambia mi vida. Ahí empiezo yo a ver que se podía hacer mejor la vida.
And he took those children home, and he took more children home. And now he has an orphanage with 830 children.
Buenas tardes.
Entendí que el dinero no tenía sentido y que había que vivir intensamente. Y me dediqué a buscar a estos chiquitos de la calle. Y son miles en la ciudad.
All love him and embrace him. He knows all of their names. He hugs and kisses them every day. And it's one of the most beautiful orphanages I've ever been to.
Decidí llevar comida a la calle. Me enteré de cosas que no se ven a diario, ¿no? Niños que deambulan, que roban, niñas que son presas fáciles de los ladrones o de los borrachos, porque no tienen a nadie. Todos los días llevaba, ya me estaba olvidando de mi trabajo y más me preocupaba yo en los chicos que estaban acá y cada día conocía más y de todas las edades.
I didn't see one unhappy face when I walked through that orphanage. Here's Miguel, he's shushing everybody before their meal. They're all anticipating the meal that they've been served. He really puts a lot of importance on praying with the children before the meal and being thankful for the meal. Every child was smiling, was laughing, was enjoying life, and was being loved.
A ver, Santa Rosa, Suki, vamos saliendo.
Eso soy producto del amor de los niños. No soy una persona que haya querido hacer esto. ¿No? Sería mentirte si te digo, oye, yo siempre quise ser cura, monja, no. Yo he querido ser siempre un hombre que tenga dinero y la pase bien. Y ahora soy una persona que tiene muchos amigos y la paso mejor.
In visiting the familia, what you see are children who are happy, children who are being fed, children who are receiving an education.
Día, Profesor Miguel.
Who have a doctor available to them when they feel poorly or when they get injured.
At the end of the day, he collapses on this couch, but still smiling. You know, I love the contrast of him on this couch, and you see all the little stuffed animals behind him. They're all a little bit dirty and raggedy, but there's just so much hope in the picture. You just see so much relief in his face.
Este mundo es maravilloso. No sé cómo nos quejamos de lo que tenemos. Así que tenemos mucho por hacer, mucho por vivir. Y a veces perdemos más tiempo en cosas que no deberíamos. Pero bueno, mañana seguirá saliendo el sol.
Gracias, Miguel, gracias.
We often hear about the Bill Gates, the Warren Buffetts, the billionaires of the world who actually decided to give away much of their wealth to help others. You don't have to be a billionaire or a millionaire to help others. In fact, what we've shown is there are a lot of little people out there that help others all the time. We can all be heroes. We all should be, at least to some extent. Give of ourselves, our time, our talent to help a person in need as often as we can. That's the only thing that's going to make this world a better place.
Bye.